Hello, welcome back everybody. We got another installment of videos for you. We had some questions in the store from some guys on picking out line class. So today we're going to do just a little touch on picking out line classes for all the different types of fishing you could be doing. Some of this will be catered to the East Coast, some of it will tie in some of the West Coast fishing in Cabo and Hawaii and stuff like that. So you're trolling and billfish stuff out here. You're picking line classes out. Locally, a lot of guys fish like 30, 50 to 80 pound mono on top of some sort of hollow or solid core braid. If you're going to be picking hollow and you're going to do that, you're probably going to pick 60 pound or 80 pound. A lot of guys like high vis just because if you're turned around looking down at the transom of the boat, you got a high vis line, you can kind of track it easier and see where all your lines are going. Some of the other colors kind of blend in with wash and other stuff, which if you're backing down on a fish can be a little bit disastrous, or you suffer a catastrophic failure and some tackle on that one. That 60 and 80 pound, you're going to be able to marry perfect with like your 50, 60 and 80 pound top shots when you're talking about serving. You want to make sure you kind of match your lines up properly. You don't want too skinny of or too thin of a mono going into too thick of a hollow core braid. That can cause some issues too. Again, another thing we'll go over in a splicing video, because we had another customer come in and wanted us to go in depth on some splicing and how we do it in here too. So stay tuned for that one at a later date. The other thing you can look at, you could use solid core braid. You're going to do the same thing. You're just going to tie, you'll just bring your two lines together with like a RP or some sort of connection knot that you know. You'd be doing something with any of the PowerPro solid braids. Like this is a red 65 right here. And like I said, we were talking in the hollow core braid, it goes 60, 80, 100, 130, 200. On the solid core braid, they do their line a little differently. You generally go like 50, 65, 80, 100 pound. There's not a lot of solid core 130s out there. Usually jumps to 150 after that. But some brands do make it in like 120 or 130 in solid. And you don't need particularly heavy line for striped marlin fishing in SoCal. If you were, say, going down to Cabo and fishing in Hawaii, we'll generally see a lot of those guys with 200 pound hollow backing, 80s and 130 reels, and you got 1,500 yards of backing and 130 Amelon top shots on them and stuff like that. It's not something we're really used to down here locally. The East Coast guys will be a little more familiar with it too. If you guys are tuning in the video watching, you guys are familiar with the 130 to 200 backing on your stuff and hollow splicing with all that big marlin. Even the canyon stuff you guys are doing is generally going to be some hollow core. And the reason I do that is just you're going in and out of the guides constantly. Knots can break down going in and out of guides constantly. And if you're going to want to use the mono top shot, which a lot of people still do, and you need it in a lot of cases. You want to have a smooth connection where you just serve it through, goes through the guides nice and smooth, whether it's a ring guide or a roller guide. You're just going to get a really smooth pass through the guides, and it's not going to break down the knot so fast, and it holds really well too. It's kind of like a little Chinese finger trap. I mean, it's really almost impossible to pull out on a hollow core splice. You can have line break and stuff like that, but you almost never going to break off on that if it's done correctly. The other thing we'll talk about in terms of like trolling in SoCal is island fishing. Say you're island fishing or you're out there tuna fishing and you want to, you got a pot of dolphins you want to pull up in front of and get like a little jig strike on like a Rapala or something like that, and then start throwing bait and fishing bait afterwards with that. We see a lot of guys still using the 65 solid core and the 80 solid cores or 100 solid core braid and just tying knots. It's not, you're not as high tense a situation in a chair with huge amount of drags on stuff where you need such a secure connection. And most of our knots are pretty secure as it is if you're comfortable in it. If you're not, then come into the store, we'll teach you a few knots and make sure you master it before you leave. But yeah, you're gonna be, you're trolling a Rapala, say, and you wanna go catch some yellows at the island, and your first thought's like, hey, I'm gonna be cruising around kind of slow, why not throw a little troller back there just to see. Yeah, you're going to probably be, again, going towards like a solid core braid of some sort. You've got 65 pound, again, here we'd pick out for something like that. I've got some diamond 80 and 65 right here in an 8X. This is all solid core braid too. And again, diamond is a great price point online. You really can't beat it. PowerPro is just a little bit thinner, and it's a little more consistent in terms of like the wax coat and everything like that. But the Diamond is you can't go wrong. You'll probably end up having some sort of floral leader tied on top of it, and it's, you know, a lot of times in a pinch, I don't bring just a trolling rod to the island with me. I'm going out there planning to fish bait most of the time, and maybe fish some jigs if you get lucky enough to get put in that situation. So in that case, you probably want to use like one of your 8-foot medium heavy sticks for something like that. Some with not as fast of an action, and then just use your solid core braid and tie straight to your floral leader of like 50 or 60 pound, maybe 80 pound. You don't have to have floral for that either. I mean, it's a jig strike, jig bite. It's pretty reactionary. You could get away with mono on that one. Just, you know, it's totally up to you. Or in that case, you might only have floral on the boat and be like, I forgot the mono, so go for it. But solid core braid is what we usually suggest for something like that. And it's generally going to be, you know, 50, 65, 80 pound braid is at most what we fish at the island. So if you're East Coast guys, you don't fish kind of similar to us in that sense. You use a lot of that solid core braid for like some of your jigging and stuff like that. We'll touch on that one in a second here. But say you're trolling for like bluefin and you want to do some Mad Mac fishing or spreader bar or even the kite. You want to go fish the kite. You're going to be fishing a lot heavier braid. Obviously the 65 and the 80s aren't going to really it's not going to really matter to you in that sense. We're fishing a lot of 150. You fish 100 pound too. We got like some red 100 pound and PowerPro here. I got some heavier stuff from Diamond G3, their G3 8X, which is another solid core. I usually suggest always a solid core again because I was talking about how the hollow braid kind of can float sometimes. So can regular braid, kind of floats. You see a lot of guys still use a lot of mono when they're bait fishing because of the very same thing, where the line will sink a little bit more with the mono on there, and it's a good tactic, especially when fish are being finicky and you need to get the bait down a little bit. Yeah, some of the braid can kind of float and just put a little top shot on top of there. But in the most case, you know, if you're gonna be doing that heavy tuna fishing, you're gonna be using the heavier line, and always go with solid core, especially kite fishing. The hollow core kind of soaks up water over time a little bit, and you can sag on the kite a little bit. And aside from that, it kind of can spin up on you a little bit too and twist up, especially trolling Mad Max. And the big one for all you guys that coming in lately is jigging. The slow pitch jigging, the speed jigging, which kind of ties into like some of the rail fishing we're doing on the West Coast. But the all-encompassing one for the slow pitch jigging that guys are doing nowadays, we see a lot of the metered line coming through, right? The PowerPro metered line we see being more popular on the West Coast here, just because it's every 100 feet, and we're counting for bluefin, and they're, you know, captains are like, it's at 250 feet, so you need to have a better idea of exactly where you're at, and it's in 100 foot or 50 or 25, you know, foot increments. Most of the other braids in meters, and it's somewhere like 25, 30 meters to every color break or black hash mark. For a lot of the guys that are doing like the bottom fish jigging and stuff like that, we're seeing guys go with like 30, 40, and 50 pound lighter lines, especially here on the West Coast. We've been graced with dropping to deeper depths now and fishing zones that haven't been fished in quite some time. And with that comes, you know, scope issues, and you got in some cases you got 30 guys on a boat trying to do the same thing. If you're one of those guys that's jigging on the boat like that, the thinner line is definitely going to be the way to go. And we say that obviously because the scope issue, and a lot of guys are like, well, can you really catch like 2 rockfish on one line on 30 pound and 40 pound? I mean, you're not applying a particularly large amount of drag. You're pretty normal drags, more than enough that 30 pound will be fine. 40 pound will be fine, and you'll do yourself a huge favor in that and not tangle as many people and find yourself more up and down, or be more accurate on actually dropping on a spot. You got to remember, some of these spots are probably no bigger than this table sometimes that you're dropping on. Maybe not on the sport boats, but on your private boat especially. You know, we fish a little bit smaller of rockfish spots, and you get these stony areas, and they're no bigger than, you know, this table right here, that 30 pound, that 40 pound at 600 feet. You're going to be able to target and actually hit more of the corners and the edges and the good spots on these rockfish spots that you're trying to target. It's just something we've seen and learned over the last few years of jigging and adopting that that style of fishing on the West Coast. Obviously, the East Coast guys are way more proficient. They've been doing this a lot longer. Japanese guys in the JDM market of all this stuff is just exploding in terms of options of jigs and rods and all that kind of stuff. But the one thing stays the same, they all are using metered braid. So that's something we would really suggest you get yourself dialed in on for the slow pitch, the fast pitch jigging, just to keep your depths accurate and keep yourself, in the game. You pay all this money for your gear and to go fishing, and the best thing you can do for yourself is not cheap out and go, oh, I think I can mark my braid with some Sharpie. And you end up with soaking your braid, Sharpie bleeds onto some of your other braid, and you're like, I think this is 100 feet. I don't know. Just do yourself the favor ahead of time, protect your investment in going fishing, and get the gear done right the first time. So we really push that meter braid on everybody for the jigging stuff, the bottom fishing, which kind of ties into the next part we'll talk about with the rail rod fishing and that jigging style with all that. Obviously, it's a much heavier braid we're using, especially mostly West Coast when we're talking about this. Your 400, 500 gram knife jigs and doing all that kind of stuff, we are seeing a huge increase in guys coming in, changing out their braid from the old marked line like we were talking about to the PowerPro Depth Hunter Offshore. This stuff is measured in bright colors every 100 feet. You can't miss it. Even the guy 6 beers deep on the boat can't miss this color change. I mean, it's really simple. They even break it down into black hash marks on here too. You got at 50 feet. You can count yourself down to pretty much the nearest 25-foot mark of where the captain's telling you the fish are at. The majority of us are seeing 130 and 100 pound on this. I know we were talking about like scopage on the last one and all that when it comes to getting down to depths. We're fishing a much bigger fish with much higher drag, and you guys got to remember that lighter braid, even 80 pound will work for this too, but that lighter braid below the 80 pound mark isn't always going to get the job done when it comes to 80, 100, and 150 pound fish. Can it do it? Yeah, you're going to be there working for a little while, and you got to be a little more mindful of everybody around you if you're on a sport boat, if you're on your private boat. Just careful of those trim tabs, man. They're your worst nightmare. But it's really important, guys, to make sure you get your depths in line and make sure your line's not bleeding onto your other line when it comes to Sharpie marks and stuff like that. If you guys are curious about it or want to come check out the braid and you're local, come into the shop. We have it both at our Anaheim and our Newport store. And as far as jigging goes too, I'll touch on this a little more at the end of the show, but August 24th, we have a jigging seminar put on by Shimano. So they'll have their pro staff guys coming in to do a full jigging seminar, and it's going to be on August 24th. Starts at 10 a.m., ends at 3. You don't have to go home at 3 because we don't close till 5. So if you want to keep shopping and doing things, then by all means stick around. All right, last but not least, guys, we're going to talk about some that applies a little bit more to the West Coast. It's the live bait fishing side of our segment. What we generally see a lot of guys fishing solid core braid. Obviously, out here we're fishing 15, 20, 25, 30 pound. Most of the time you're like between that 20 and 30 pound rating when you're fishing offshore or even at the island for live bait fishing. Doesn't require a ton of poundage wise when it comes to braid selection. What we suggest for most people is like 50, 65, 80 pound on the heavier side of bait fishing a little bit. Even kind of correlates to the East Coast in Florida and South Florida a little bit if you're fishing some live bait or happen to be able to cast net yourself some live bait. Kind of correlates there too. But for the most part on the West Coast, we're going to see a lot of this style of fishing. And color-wise, like I get this question all the time. Does color make a huge difference in my bites, or does it scare away the fish? Color is strictly so you could see it. You could either be that dude that is 5, 6 o'clock in the morning and you're blind as a bat and you can't see. You go for a brighter white or a high-vis yellow. I know sometimes on the sport boats they go, you don't want to be the only person with yellow braid, especially if you're that dude that's a tangler. If you're one of those dudes, then probably pick something like white or something so you can get away with it a little more incognito-ly. But this makes a huge difference in only your preference and being able to see at dawn and dusk when a lot of fishing tends to be really good. Some guys like to portion it, like we were talking about, with a little bit of mono on top and a little bit of the braid backing. You know, you do a 50-50 or a 60-40. It doesn't really matter. That is purely preference, up to you. The main thing that we talked about earlier is that mono. A mono does sink a little bit, so when you're island fishing and you're trying to get a bait down a little bit, or they're in the lower part of the water column, then yeah, you're gonna wanna get something in there that'll help sink the bait out a little bit and make that easier on the bait. And putting a little mono on there will do that. Or if your gear is mostly full of braid and you're at that point where you're like, man, I wish my bait would sink out a little more and butt hooking's not quite working, you could wind a little bit of that fluorocarbon on there and put 6, 7, 8 feet or more on there and end up with the same effect that you'd have from the mono, just without the stretch, obviously, and you'd have a little more abrasion resistance too with the fluoro. It's a little stiffer, a little more dense of a line. But yeah, that solely comes down to preference. You know, we don't like to say there's like a right or a wrong answer on that one. You know, which works best for you is what we would definitely suggest. You know, we'll give you guidelines. You come into the store and ask either one of us or any of my guys at any of the stores. They're going to kind of go along with what your preference is and not try and change everything too much unless you're absolutely way off. We'll be real with you. If you come in and you got some stuff that's pretty out there, we'll be like, hey man, I don't know if that's going to work. But that's the perks of coming in here and being able to shop and ask us and pick our brains. Every one of our guys at these stores here has tons of offshore experience. If they don't already run boats themselves, they're in the process of getting into it. There's some of the heavier bait applications we were talking about, like the long range guys, your cabito fishing or your chunk bait fishing. And yeah, that hollow might come into play for a lot of those because you're gonna be using heavier line and it's easier to have a more smooth connection that way without a big bulky knot there on 130 or 100 pound or 200 pound with this big old knot going through the guides going kum 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 as you go through. That makes a big difference in landing your fish. You got a fish close to gaff and it goes and takes off and you got tight drag on it. And your knot's just at the end of its life and you haven't retied it recently and you got heavy line, yeah, you have a real good chance of breaking off on that final run if they do decide to go that way. Wind-ons too are a good option if you're heavy bait fishing. You can use your solid braid, tie a bimini. If you don't know how to tie one, come in, we'll teach you. If you're on the boat and it's too late already, ask a deckhand man. That's what they're all there for. They'll tie you a bimini. You can get a wind-on there real quick and you're off to the races. We're gonna go into the last little bit of the segment here and we're just gonna talk about jig fishing. Pretty simple one. I mean, this stands for the East Coast, the West Coast, and by jig fishing we mean like casting. You're jig and pop fishing on the East Coast for bluefin, or something that's become really big on the West Coast, the same kind of deal, the jig and pop fishing for bluefin out here on a little bit bigger class side of things. We'll talk about that and the smaller side of things. You see a lot of guys fishing still solid braid. There's no reason to change everything up and fish a hollow core braid for that. I know some people are like, oh, you can have a really smooth knot and it doesn't go through the guides. If you portion your gear out correctly, if you say you're yellowtail fishing and you put a 150-yard top shot on there of like 40 pound, generally you'll see guys 30 and 40 pound for surface iron fishing especially. That jig will it's gonna swim really well with that. Don't go up to 50 and 60 pounds. Some people suggest it. And put a bunch of like steel leader on there and do some wonky stuff. But you're gonna want to go with some solid core braid. And your main thing too, if you're fishing that, you'll have a plenty enough line. You're not going to cast a knot until you're already laid a perfect cast down, hopefully. Another thing you're going to look at too is if you're jig and pop fishing on this side of things, we'll pick out like 65 and 80 pound braids. Those guys right there will generally, I mean, it's really hard to break 65 and 80 pound braid. We deep drop swordfish out here with it. They do it on the East Coast, they deep drop swordfish with it. So it's got plenty of pulling power for you. Don't think you have to go to 100 pound just to catch a 65, 80 or 100, 150 pound tuna. It'll work with 80 pound just fine. Done it hundreds of times, had hundreds of customers doing the same thing. So I'm sure you'll be fine on that one. The main thing you're gonna look at is, are you able to cast straight braid? Because you're going to want to maximize how much line you have on there on a bigger fish so that if he takes longer runs, you don't have to get stressed out, worry. Because that's when we see failure is guys get stressed out, worried, oh, I don't have enough line, let's crank up the drag. And now you just lost a fish of a lifetime, especially on a long rod. You turn up a drag and do some crazy stuff like that and panic, you could break rods, fail on your tackle side of things. Lose a rod in the water. I've seen that a few times from customers. But the main thing is you're going to want to break your line up so you'll have 300-400 yards on your reel. a braided line, 65 or 80. 80 would be preferable in this situation, but you're gonna have some pre-done leaders on your lures. So if it's a stick bait or a popper, you maybe want to put a heavier bite leader, especially targeting some bigger fish. And by bite leader, I mean, put some 100-pound, 130, 200, put a nice, short leader, 3 feet tops, and then break it with a swivel on one side, and then you can either tie or crimp to the other side to your popper or whatever lure you're going to be casting at that foamer. The reason we do that is they're kind of toothy, right? Bluefin have pretty decent teeth in their mouth, and they can saw you off pretty easily. We see that with the knife jigs that we've done in previous videos where we're using braided hooked leaders and stuff on that, just so that you don't get sawed off in a longer fight. That same thing applies to the popper fishing for tuna out here, even the East Coast. You see guys using a little bit heavier leader. The nice thing about the swivel too is you don't have any connection out there. You don't have anything to spin up and fail on you or anything like that. You could crimp, you could tie it, either one, depending, 100, 130, you could tie a clean knot on. Once you get to 200 and above, it's obviously you're going to want to crimp because you're not going to tie too clean of a knot. And if you're not someone who's super confident in your knots already, I mean, crimping is a pretty simple way to assure yourself. Just remember to burn that tag line end before you pull it all the way through and set your crimp. I've seen that save people on numerous occasions, even guys that have forgotten to crimp. They burnt it, but because they burnt it and they didn't crimp it, they still landed that fish. Yeah, it's a miracle, and don't depend on it, but in a pinch or in a situation where you just kind of like got excited and forgot, that is the best way to insure yourself, like a little insurance policy. And it's a rather cheap one at that. We would love to help you and make sure you're more successful on the water. Our job here mainly, and the reason we're doing these videos, is to save you guys money on the water. Come in here, ask us questions, and we'll cut that learning edge for you. Because it took us a lot of money and a lot of years to learn this stuff, and we'd love to bestow the knowledge that we've taken and spent time to learn onto you guys and save you time and money. That's how we build happy customers and lifetime customers that turn into friends sometimes. So if you guys have any questions ever, just call in, come to the store, love to help you. That about kind of concludes up our line selection video we're doing for the day. If you guys have any questions or comments, drop them in the comment below, and love to hear from you. Thanks, guys.